Individually, we spend between €1,300 and €2,000 a year on alcohol. But to what cost is our national pastime having on our health? And what is the government going to do about it? Joining us, Marcella Corcoran-Kennedy, Junior Minister for Health Promotion, Frank Murray of the Royal College of Physicians, Sabina Brennan, psychologist at Trinity College Dublin, and Keith Redmond, Fingal County Councillor and founder of the Hibernia Forum. If you'd like to comment on the programme, you can text us at 53131 and place the word "tonight" before your comment, or send us a tweet at #VinB, or email us at tonight@tv3.ie. Now, Marcella, you are the first health promotion minister that's been appointed in well over a decade, as I understand it, and you've had a few weeks now to read yourself into the brief. This, I think, will be one of the key pieces of legislation during your time. Do you think that Irish people, for Irish citizens, there's a special case in relation to alcohol and a need to curb our passion for drink?
Well, there's no doubt that I think every family in the country would know of somebody who has had a problem with harmful drinking. And so it's very real to all of us in our society. And the evidence is increasingly there. We're drinking far more alcohol than we did. For example, since the 60s, we're drinking 3 times as much alcohol per capita for people over 15 years of age. So the figures are there, it's well researched. We can see the impacts of excessive consumption of alcohol for the individual, for their families, for our communities. We see the difficulties around antisocial behaviour. We see our A&Es at the weekends where people are presenting either having had accidents because they have too much alcohol. We see the potential for sexual assaults increase. So the impacts are myriad. I mean, it's across all of society, and certainly we have to address our consumption of alcohol, the way we're consuming alcohol. You know, binge drinking is certainly a feature in our culture of drinking alcohol. If you look at some of the countries abroad, people drink alcohol, but they drink it differently than we do. So we have a lot of dangers in how we're drinking alcohol, and so it is very important for the government to recognise this and to set about trying to change it and to help us so that we can live better lives ourselves, that we understand, you know, how much alcohol we can safely drink, and, you know, the impacts of consuming alcohol, how it can affect us all. I mean, Professor Murray is joining us here tonight. You know, the fact that liver disease is a very creeping disease on women in particular is very, very sobering, if you pardon the pun. Certainly to me, because I certainly wasn't aware to the extent that it is a disease that is on the increase. You know, I mean, when I was a young woman, the consumption of, for example, spirits was the preserve of the older man in our society. I certainly wouldn't have dreamt of drinking whiskey or brandy or anything like that, whereas I suppose the introduction of alcopops masked the harsh flavour of the hard liquor, and now younger people are drinking spirits at a much younger age. So that's where we see the real problem drinking. And of course, the access to cheap alcohol is another very significant contributor to the problems that we have.
Frank Murray, as the Minister said there, you see it in your practice as a liver specialist. How different are we from our Italian or our French counterparts? And how do you see the effects of that on hospital wards?
Thank you. Well, first of all, we're very different than the continentals. The continentals tend to drink more often, less at each session. And most continental nations drink less than we drink. So we drink more than most of the countries, and we binge more, both of which have separate negative effects, unfortunately. In our daily practice in the hospital, the biggest burden of deaths and severe illness due to alcohol is on the liver, and unfortunately, in parallel with that dramatic increase in alcohol consumption over the last 50 years that Marcella's already mentioned, as a consequence of that, we've seen a doubling or tripling in the death rate from liver failure in Ireland, and most of that is due to alcohol. So the problem is absolutely massive. But the problem isn't confined to the liver wards in the hospital. It's all through the health service, in general practice, in the psychiatric hospitals. It's seen in all different parts of the hospital. The neurologists see it, the heart doctors see it, all sorts of specialists see it, because the burden of alcohol unfortunately falls on most systems. So the problem we see is catastrophic. And just to put some brief numbers on it, 1,000 people a year, 3 people per day, die as a result of alcohol. Now that's phenomenal. That's far more than die on the road. It is, and it's like 6 or 7 aircraft crashing with no survivors. Now that is a real crisis. So I think the government, as Marcel has outlined, already recognises that there's a crisis. The evidence is stark and can't be argued with. What we would argue is that we should have evidence-based solutions in relation to this, and many have been suggested, and many are in the Public Health Alcohol Bill. So I think you can see there is a problem, there's evidence for it, there are solutions, and there is evidence for those solutions.
Sabina Browne, can you tell us a little bit about why you think that we might have a particular problem in relation to denial around this problem that Frank has just so eloquently outlined, in terms of 3 people a day are dying from alcohol, from drinking too much alcohol, basically. But you never hear conversation about that generally among Irish people the way you would even about road traffic accidents or people dying on the road.
I only learned that statistic this evening, But
why don't we acknowledge it, do you think?
I think what's really interesting is, just even from what we've spoken about already, is that we've mentioned figures and quantifying alcohol as a problem. And most of the research around European alcohol consumption is around quantity. And it's not looking at things like social factors and cultural factors that influence our drinking habits, as Frank referred to. An interesting thing is, in most studies around alcohol, Italians are excluded because they don't have problem drinking. So we're looking for solutions by looking at the problem, instead of actually looking at where there's not a problem and trying to understand what factors, what social contexts may actually encourage healthful drinking, or drinking in moderation, because that's our issue. Globally, on a global scale, drinking in moderation, is what happens for the most part, and your opposite ends of the extreme are abstinence or excessive alcohol consumption, and it's down here where you actually have the problem. And we're looking for a solution by looking further and deeper into the problem. So I think we need to look, I think there's a lot of measures out there that can be taken based on those quantitative figures, but I think we need to widen and develop evidence-based approach that acknowledge specific cultural contexts. And we have a very specific cultural context in Ireland, in that we condone excessive, dangerous alcohol consumption on a daily and regular basis. We condone it. We sit in a pub and we watch somebody drinking, binge drinking, more than binge drinking, drinking themselves sometimes into alcohol poisoning. And it's okay, we don't say it. It's kind of not okay to say to somebody, you're drinking too much.
Keith Redmond, would that be your experience, that we do, as a nation, have very special needs in relation to alcohol and how we might curb it, and that there is, as Sabina's just outlined, this culture that's there where we condone it, or we turn a blind eye to people getting blind drunk, essentially?
I think it's our culture around drinking is spoken about as if we're the only country in the world that has any issue with alcohol. I mean, I think our cousins in the UK have a very similar culture when it comes to alcohol. Similarly, Northern Europeans, whether they be Dutch, German, Scandinavians, that kind of beer culture is throughout Northern Europe. The wine culture in the south of Europe, if you compare us to them, yes, obviously our drinking culture is different. The United States have a separate drinking culture, again, very much focused on hard liquor and spirits, as opposed to many pints after pints like we do in Northern Europe. So I suppose every country is a little bit different, but I don't think we're a standout. I mean, I think
but
it's
surely if you look at some of the figures that Frank outlined for us there, it shows that we are pretty standout.
We're not. I'll give you, I think it was very important that both the Minister and Frank mentioned the 1960s, and they make all of the comparisons to the 1960s, and they say that we drink 3 times more than we did in the 1960s, and it's very telling that they picked that particular date, because they don't want to pick, for example, 2001. From 2001 to now, we are now drinking 25% less as a country. We are 40% less beer and whiskey as a country. And our pub consumption of alcohol is down 35%. So when you take a window from 2001...
is that because people are drinking more at home?
No, because beer and whiskey is drank at home. And so, this has nothing to do with that. Pub consumption is a separate thing, but it is also down. But it's telling that they choose the 1960s, and they don't choose from 2001 on.
But I'd like to address that, if I may, Keith, because I think it's very important. So unequivocally, we drink far more than we drank in the 1960s. Alcohol consumption rose fairly steadily in Ireland until 2001 when it peaked, and it's drifted down since then for a number of very good reasons. And they have been that its affordability decreased. There were specific measures such as the introduction of excise duties onto certain spirits, which reduced their alcohol consumption, and then the crash resulted in further reduction in alcohol consumption. Now, they're very important lessons. That's part of the evidence that we should learn from. In other words, alcohol sales are price sensitive in terms of affordability. So unfortunately now in Ireland, compared to 50 years ago, to go back to Keith's point, alcohol is far more affordable. People have far more discretionary income that they can spend on alcohol than they did 50 years ago. And that explains in part the rise in alcohol consumption. So Keith is quite right. There has been a fall from its peak. We do still drink far more than 2 or 3 times what we drank during the 60s. And a big explanation for that.
What about the point Keith was making in relation to the different drinking cultures, Germany, the beer, the US? Yeah. He's basically making the point we're not an exceptional case.
No, Northern Europe generally has recognised as having a crisis with relation to alcohol. Keith's quite right on that. I completely agree with that. And the British have a comparable problem. In England they drink a little bit less than us. In Scotland they drink marginally more. I don't think that means that we don't have a problem. I think we all have problems, and Scotland particularly and England recognise they've got a problem. So they recognise also that they're not standalone people in terms of the problem with alcohol.
If I can ask you, Minister, what is the financial cost of our drinking to the health service, for instance, each year?
Well, the figure that I've been provided with is it's costing 1.5 billion to the health service every year. And if you look at the cost to society in terms of productivity, in terms of road traffic accidents, it doubles that almost. So it's a significant cost. And
which would obviously go a long way towards waiting lists or other
absolutely.
initiatives.
If we could free up that money and invest it elsewhere, that's exactly where we'd want to be going. And what the Public Health Alcohol Bill is trying to address, number one, the amount of alcohol we're consuming per capita. We're trying to, I suppose, reduce the exposure of children to alcohol branding. We want to provide good labelling for people so they can understand how much.
I'm curious to ask you, though, in relation to the issue of culture, that as an elected politician, as a national politician, and now as a minister, is there a fear of being seen as a killjoy? Because it is so intrinsic to our culture and to celebrations. I mean, it was seen as a very unusual thing that the O'Donovan brothers, the rowers, last week went to bed without even a single drink after winning a silver medal. You know, that there's that amongst your constituents you'll be seen as trying to ruin their fun.
Well, I wouldn't go along with that at all, because it is the responsibility of government to intervene where we see there is a problem. And that's what we're attempting to do with the Public Health Alcohol Bill. You could say that the same arguments were put forward when the introduction of banning smoking, for example, in public houses or public buildings was introduced. There might have been that same argument placed as well. Just because some people might think that that's the case doesn't mean that we shouldn't proceed with it. At the end of the day, overconsumption, harmful consumption of alcohol is a huge cost to society, and we have to address it, and we have to address it seriously.
We'll have more after the break. Legislation the new government has promised to pass when it returns from its summer break will include new minimum pricing for alcohol. In a bid to curb alcohol consumption and get us all on a much healthier path, the forthcoming bill will see a minimum price of 10 cents per gram of alcohol. But is it fair, and could there be another solution? So continuing with our discussion, Keith Redmond, I'm wondering what your definition of a binge drinking session would be.
I'll answer that, but if I could just come back to the point that the Minister made before the break on the cost of alcohol. So the Minister said that the cost of alcohol to the health service is €1.5 billion. But what we never talk about is the revenue that alcohol brings in to the state. And with VAT and excise duty and the rest, it's almost €1 billion. Okay? In addition to that, our alcohol culture, our pubs, our nightclubs, are intrinsic to our tourist offering. And we bring in about €3 billion in tourism. So the notion that, alcohol is a standalone cost and it's not a revenue.
Does the revenue stream coming in the other side then justify the people who are dying of liver failure?
It completely eliminates the red herring of the cost to the health service. When you want to talk,
what about the cost in terms of deaths? Frank Murray mentioned earlier 3 people a day.
My personal view on that is that is the responsibility of the individual and is not the responsibility of a government to try to nanny state them. The point is, everybody knows that drinking alcohol to excess is bad for you. Everybody knows that it can cause cirrhosis and it can ultimately cost you your life. We all know that. Nobody's an idiot out there. So when you start to infantilize adults and you start to make them out to be children, and the government steps in to be their nanny, that's the point where the government has stepped over the line.
So, Cork and Kennedy, you are infantilising people and becoming even more of a nanny state.
Well, that's utter nonsense. There are serious facts here that we just cannot gloss over. 167,170 people suffered an alcohol-related assault in 2013. That's a very serious figure. 3 deaths a day are alcohol-related. There were 7,549 cases treated for problem alcohol use. We cannot get away from these figures, and you cannot just say, well, one tax versus another tax. The fact of the matter is that the evidence is stark. We must address this. We must address it as a society. And I just come back to all of the families across the country that have been touched by alcohol abuse, whether it was somebody who was driving their car with too much alcohol and caused a car accident, whether it was a woman who was waiting for her husband to come home who had too much alcohol and was angry and took it out on her, maybe the children. I mean, these are real cases. And, I think it's facetious to suggest that we're not taking this seriously and we're not giving people responsibilities and all of the rest, and giving them access to whatever they wish to do. The reality is that alcohol is a psychoactive drug, and we must realise that. We also underestimate the amount of alcohol that we're drinking ourselves. So at the end of the day, I completely reject...
60% of us, I think, is the figure, isn't it, who underestimate?
Yeah.
Sabina Brennan, do you think then that the way forward is by putting the tax on alcohol, that you're going to it will reduce consumption?
I think clearly that's an evidence-based approach. It says that it will reduce consumption. I don't believe that it is the only solution. I think we need wider and more solutions. Just touching back on what you said about infantilising adults, the problem in Ireland is children drink alcohol. Alcohol consumption starts as early as 12, 13 and 14 in Ireland, and we learn our drinking behaviours from our adults. So if our adults are binge drinking at a very young age, before you're physically and properly developed, you're drinking in an inappropriate way. So, but I think we need to take wider steps and wider measures, and we need to address the current issue.
What do you mean by what sort of wider measures?
Well, I think so. We need to address the current issue, but also we need to start addressing it further down the line. So we need to start addressing the issue, for example, of teen drinking or starting to drink alcohol extremely young, and before you can even get into a pub, before you're even legally allowed to drink alcohol. And I think part of that has to come down to developing a culture, actually like you see in Italian cultures, where there are other things for teenagers to do. Widen horizons and
Keith Redmond,
support our kids.
do you have a problem with us protecting children and teenagers from alcohol?
Oh, of course. I mean, the most virulent argument of any nanny stater is, what about the children? I mean, we start off talking about adults, and we immediately, when we realise we're losing the argument when we're talking about adults, we move to children.
It's a fact.
So,
I mean, there are statistics to show.
Right.
Sorry, can I come back?
I can show you statistics that the statistics on teen drinking in Ireland has dropped in the last 5 years by Eurostat measure. So, across the board, our drinking as a society is dropping, even amongst our teens.
But our females are drinking as much as males, and girls are suffering more as a consequence. We're having more incidents of fetal alcohol syndrome. You can talk about the liver issues, but it's also other consequences. It's consequences of increased levels of sexually transmitted diseases. When you drink alcohol, it affects your frontal lobes. It impairs your judgment. You engage in behaviours that you may not engage in if you didn't have alcohol on board. And particularly if you're a teenager, if you're a young adult, you're particularly vulnerable. Your brain isn't properly developed. Your ability to make decisions isn't properly developed, and you end up in situations and doing things that have knock-on
Mary,
consequences.
how do people not? There are many people out there now, I think, who drink who don't realise they have a problem, or that they're a problem drinker. Why do health markers not show that up? Or is it it's the nature of damage from alcohol?
Unfortunately, most people who present with advanced liver disease, for instance, and advanced disease to other organs, which will kill them or greatly disable them, unfortunately, when alcohol is the cause, they have no symptoms till it's too late. So they arrive in hospital with liver failure or problems with their brain.
Who is your typical patient, if there is one? Male, female, age?
All of the above. So they're all ages and male and female. What's changed dramatically?
And how young?
So we are seeing people with liver failure in their 30s, which we never saw before. We're seeing women in particular at much younger ages developing liver failure and dying from alcohol. And a typical picture would be somebody who drinks half a bottle of wine each night during the week and maybe a bottle of wine a day at the weekend. Now that's the kind of thing that gets you.
And is that over a couple of years?
Over many years.
Right.
So to develop liver failure from alcohol, you need to drink for several years. So the important take-home messages are that, unfortunately, we know from hard data, hard evidence, that most people who drink in Ireland drink excessively. They drink in a way that's hazardous or harmful. That's not my data. That's the HRB data from 2013.
Health Research Board.
Correct. Referred to already. The second thing is that the pattern of alcohol drinking has changed dramatically. It's much more gender balanced now, and more alcohol is consumed at home than in the pub. So it's interesting hearing what Keith says, that MUP will have a negative impact on tourism. It will have no impact.
Explain what you mean by MUP.
So minimum unit price is one of the key and probably the most important initiative in the public health bill that's under consideration by the government and by the Oireachtas. Minimum unit pricing is a very clever manoeuvre because it targets people who are vulnerable in relation to alcohol, particularly people who are drinking very heavily and the younger people. And it puts a floor price on the price of alcohol. So in other words, it says alcohol can't be sold at less than 10 pence per gram, roughly 10 pence a pound per unit, 100 cents per unit. Now,
that's not going. Can I go back for a moment to what you were saying about the woman in her 40s who's at home having a half a bottle of wine every night, possibly a bottle at weekends? Minimum unit pricing isn't going to make much difference there, is it?
So I think other measures are needed elsewhere. So I would argue that we need many. So rather than Keith saying we need no measures, I'd say we need lots of different measures to reduce alcohol harm in Italy, where they've dramatically reduced the amount of alcohol consumed and the number of people dying from liver disease and other diseases associated with alcohol. They haven't done it with one measure. They've had lots of different measures. And that's part of the great thing about the Public Health Alcohol Bill. It's got lots of different measures, including minimum unit pricing of alcohol. Now, the great thing about minimum unit pricing of alcohol, if I can finish, it gets rid of pocket money drink. It makes it more difficult for children to get drunk. And that's the problem in Ireland. It's not that they drink alcohol, because they do drink alcohol on the continent. They drink alcohol and get drunk. And that's the real issue in Ireland.
So, Marcella Corkin-Kennedy, what about the middle classes in Ireland and the culture of drinking and the unacknowledged culture of drinking? What will the bill do about that?
Well, the bill is targeting the hazardous and heavy drinkers in minimum unit pricing. And I'd like to address a point, if you don't mind, in relation to what Keith said. Minimum unit pricing has been proven to work in British Columbia and Canada, for example. When they introduced it, they found, when they did the research, that there were less deaths from alcohol-related drinking, and there were less hospital admissions. So there is evidence there that it is in fact working. And to address the point about children, we have a great example of that here in this country, where we decided to tackle the consumption of tobacco, for example, made very unpopular decisions. But there we are now approaching a generation of children who will never smoke tobacco. I mean, that is just phenomenal. And how did the government address that at the time? They put the tobacco, put it in its place. It's a special product. It's not something that was to be consumed or purchased as part of your everyday grocery shop. Alcohol is the very same. We need to put alcohol back into the category that it was. It's a special product. And if we can remove the viewing of alcohol branding, having children absorb this almost by osmosis from the day almost they're born, or they can look at a screen or go in the shopping trolley with their mother, that they won't see alcohol branding, that they won't be exposed to it, then it won't become the norm for them to start drinking alcohol at a very young age. But in terms of the minimum unit pricing and whether it's going to have an impact on people who are able to afford alcohol, again, there is evidence in those other countries that have introduced it that the awareness that has been raised by intervening has actually made people consume alcohol with less pure alcohol. So they're now buying, instead of maybe wine that is 12.5% or 13%, they're actually buying wine which is 9 or 10%. So in a way, the additional information that is going to be provided by way of the bill is actually going to be very impactful on people, because it'll be giving them the information to make the decisions around how much alcohol they'll consume and purchase.
Keith Redmond, surely you would acknowledge the astounding success of the tobacco ban and the influence that has had, as the Minister has said, even on that there's a generation of Irish children now, many of whom don't even know what a cigarette looks like.
Absolutely. I think that nobody should be smoking in a room when it harms somebody else in the same room. Nobody would defend that. I'm not talking. I mean, I would defend somebody. I would defend. You talk about the
visibility of cigarettes.
You've spoken about the ban causing this. You spoke about the ban in workplaces causing this. I'm addressing that. So the ban in workplaces was absolutely correct, because other people suffered from your smoking. But if I could just take a few minutes just to kind of counteract the issue. Well, in fairness, the other two speakers have had a bit of time, okay? The minimum unit alcohol pricing, okay, is targeting, correct? It's targeting only the poor. It doesn't affect anybody who can afford above that floor. So, in other words, if somebody goes and has a few cans from Aldi or Lidl, it's them that's affected. If somebody wants to get a bottle of wine for €4 or €5 in a cheap supermarket, it's those that are affected. It doesn't affect politicians and doctors who go home and open up a bottle of Chateauneuf de Pape. It doesn't affect middle-class women who are drinking, who are now the biggest...
So, Frank Murray, so if we can take it maybe point by point, in that instance, if you're only helping, and Keith would put that, I think, in inverted commas,
patronising
one section of the population, it's not worth doing that.
So I think it's worth just saying two important points. Most other conditions are associated with a better outlook than they were 50 years ago, except for liver disease. And so the mortality, the death rate from liver disease in Ireland and in Britain has gone up dramatically. In cancer and heart disease and everything else, we're doing much better. We're doing much worse in liver disease. In terms of the social justice argument, I think that the most powerful argument actually is the social justice argument. I would argue strongly against what Keith says there, because disproportionately the consequences of alcohol fall among people who are less well off in society. They have higher mortality, a higher death rate, a higher problem rate with alcohol. So actually, I think it's in their better interest to be able to afford less alcohol. So
briefly, Minister, if I can ask you, why no ban on sports sponsorship by alcohol companies?
Well, my understanding of that is that it was considered and in the last administration. And I think that the sport committee examined it and made a recommendation on it. But a cabinet committee also reviewed it and decided against it based on significant lobbying that there wouldn't be sufficient opportunity to have funding for very large sporting events.
Isn't that key, that the significant lobbying by the industry meant that it
I just want to continue the point. I feel personally that what would happen here, I think, is what happened in France, where when they introduced the ban on alcohol sponsorship, other companies who are not providing alcohol stepped in and provided sponsorship. So I think there is certainly potential there. Remember, the bill is going to committee stage. We're waiting for a date on that, and hopefully it'll be in the autumn. I'm looking forward to that. And we are now in a new administration. It's a new government, but there may be amendments put forward, and so we'd have to consider all of that.
New politics. Sorry, I'm afraid we have to wrap it there. We'll be back for a preview of tomorrow morning's newspapers after the break.